storm raged outside as Elliot Harrington, a billionaire who had conquered Wall Street, faced the most defining moment of his life. He stood at the crossroads of love and betrayal, torn between his devoted pregnant wife Lena and the seductive, calculating Mira Caldwell. His mind, clouded by temptation, led him toward a decision that would unravel everything he had built. Elliot had once sworn to cherish Lena, the woman who had stood beside him when he was merely a rising force in high finance. Yet, as wealth and power consumed him, so did an insatiable hunger for more thrills, more passion, more reckless abandon. He thought he was in control, a master strategist both in the boardroom and beyond. But what he didn't realize was that this choice would set off a chain of devastating consequences, ones that not even his billions could undo. From the outside, Elliot Harrington lived the American dream. As the only son of Walter Harrington, a legendary business mogul, he had inherited Harrington Industries, a conglomerate with a reach spanning from luxury resorts to steel manufacturing. His name carried weight in exclusive clubs from New York to Monaco, whispered with admiration in the halls of power. By 38, he had everything, a net worth soaring into the billions, a mansion in the Hamptons, a penthouse in Manhattan, and a private island off the Florida coast. His days were filled with high-stakes acquisitions, power plays in lavish boardrooms, and evenings spent in the glow of Manhattan's elite. But beneath the glittering surface, something gnawed at him. A restless emptiness, a hunger he couldn't name. Expensive whiskey, high-end travel, and the constant pursuit of dominance no longer satisfied him. That void only deepened when he met Mira Caldwell, a woman who exuded danger, charm, and the kind of unrelenting ambition that both intrigued and intoxicated him. Before Mira, there was Lena, the woman who had given his life meaning beyond wealth and power. They had met at a charity gala in Washington, D.C., where she was translating for an international refugee organization. Lena was everything Elliot wasn't: selfless, driven by purpose rather than profit. While he maneuvered in a world of hostile takeovers and multi-million-dollar deals, she fought for the voiceless, advocating for human rights with an unwavering spirit. She had never been impressed by his wealth. In their early days, she insisted on paying her own way, shunning the extravagant gifts he tried to offer. Lena was a rare find, a woman who loved him not for his status, but for the man he was beneath it all. For 4 years, they built a marriage grounded in something deeper than luxury, a bond that once felt unbreakable. But Elliot was about to risk it all for a fleeting temptation, and in doing so, he would unleash a tragedy beyond anything he had ever faced. Lena Harrington had never been drawn to wealth, nor was she captivated by the power her millionaire husband wielded. What made her different was her sincerity, an unshakable integrity that stood firm against the temptations of luxury. She insisted on splitting the bill at restaurants, never once hinted at wanting extravagant gifts, and refused to compromise her values for the privileges that came with being the wife of one of America's most powerful men. In Elliot's world of social climbers and insatiable ambition, Lena was a breath of fresh air. For 3 blissful years, they built a love that felt untouchable, a connection that seemed immune to the corrupting forces of excess. She wasn't just his wife, she was his guiding light, the force that grounded him in a life where success often came at the cost of morality. But even the strongest anchors can slip, and as the night skyline of Manhattan shimmered outside the tinted windows of his limousine, Elliot felt himself unraveling. His pregnant wife was at home, yet here he was, caught in the gravitational pull of a temptation he wasn't ready to resist. He had told himself it was nothing at first, a thrill, a harmless escape. But deep down, he knew this wasn't a detour. It was the beginning of a fall he couldn't undo. When Elliot and Lena had married, New York's elite had been shocked. They had expected him to choose a glamorous socialite, perhaps even foreign royalty, someone who could match his prestige. Instead, he had fallen for a woman whose radiance came not from couture gowns, but from the goodness in her heart. Lena had grown up in the small town of Fairhaven, Massachusetts, raised by 2 dedicated schoolteachers, Harold and Margaret Sullivan. Her childhood had been one of modesty, but she had never seen it as a disadvantage. It had taught her the values of kindness, fairness, and resilience, principles she carried with her into adulthood. Adjusting to Elliot's world hadn't been easy. One moment she was working long hours at a nonprofit law clinic in Boston, living in a tiny studio apartment, and the next she was walking into charity galas where the cost of a single gown exceeded her entire year's rent. She would be lying if she said the transition was effortless. But, unlike so many who became lost in the allure of wealth, Lena refused to be consumed by it. Instead, she channeled her position into something meaningful, using her influence to support humanitarian efforts, championing causes that mattered. It wasn't long before her quiet grace earned the respect of those around her, including Elliot's closest confidants, his longtime friend and Harrington Industries CFO, Matthew Clark, and his father's former assistant, Sylvia Whitmore, a woman who had been a trusted advisor to the Harrington family for decades. Yet even with the admiration of those who mattered, Lena could sense a change in Elliot. Something was shifting between them, subtle at first, but growing stronger with each passing day. She just didn't know that the storm on the horizon was far closer than she had ever imagined. To those around her, Lena Harrington was more than just the pregnant wife of a billionaire. She was a force of compassion in a world often ruled by power and greed. While others in high society spent their mornings indulging in luxury, Lena's day began at dawn. By 6 a.m., she would be in the kitchen, blending fresh fruit smoothies while scanning the latest human rights reports. She dedicated her time to shelters, organized legal aid workshops for immigrants, and tirelessly managed her late father-in-law's philanthropic foundation. But unlike the wealthy socialites who sought recognition, she worked in quiet determination, refusing to chase publicity. She never wanted to appear in magazines or be paraded around in society columns. For her, the impact mattered, not the attention. Elliot had once admired that about her. In the beginning, it was part of why he loved her. She had shown him a world beyond corporate takeovers and high-stakes investments. With her, he had discovered the beauty of genuine connection, the value of kindness over power. And yet, as the years passed, that same virtue became a mirror reflecting everything he lacked. The more she shone as a beacon of selflessness, the more he became painfully aware of his own ruthless ambition. Guilt gnawed at him in ways he didn't understand. He found himself restless, craving an escape from the purity Lena embodied. It wasn't something he consciously acknowledged, not yet, but the unease simmered beneath the surface, waiting for the perfect storm. When Lena announced her pregnancy after 3 years of marriage, the world saw Elliot as a man overjoyed by the prospect of fatherhood. His colleagues toasted to the future heir of Harrington Industries. His friends clapped him on the back, and his wife's face radiated maternal bliss. But beneath his polished exterior, doubts twisted inside him like an unseen current. Would fatherhood confine him? Would it strip away the freedom and thrill that came with his life of private jets, late-night parties, and spontaneous indulgences? The questions lurked in the shadows of his mind, unanswered and growing louder. He had no idea that those unspoken fears would soon drive him toward choices that would destroy the very foundation of his life. Mira Caldwell arrived in New York with nothing but a small suitcase and an oversized ambition. She had once confided in her childhood friend, Clara Morales, an aspiring actress, that she would do whatever it took to rise to the top. If she couldn't become the next Hollywood sensation, she would carve out power by any means necessary. Born to a bartender and a seamstress in rural Iowa, Mira had no pedigree, no connections, only an uncanny magnetism that made people gravitate toward her. She knew how to make people feel important, how to read their desires, and mold herself into exactly what they wanted. It was a skill she would wield with precision, and soon it would lead her straight into the arms of a billionaire husband who was on the brink of self-destruction. Mira Caldwell had a rare gift. She could read people's desires and twist them to her advantage. She never hesitated to use this skill when opportunity struck. The first time she laid eyes on Elliot Harrington was at an exclusive gala, hosted by Harrington Industries to support underprivileged students. She had secured an invitation through an older investment banker who was all too eager to please her. Dressed in a sleek black gown that hugged her figure in all the right places, Mira glided across the polished floors of the Waldorf Astoria, every movement calculated to draw attention. She didn't need to seek out Elliot, she simply made herself impossible to ignore. Elliot, playing the role of charismatic host, floated effortlessly from one circle of wealthy guests to another, his presence commanding respect. But when his gaze finally met Mira's, something flickered in his expression. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was the first dangerous spark of attraction. She smiled, soft, mysterious, inviting. And just like that, she knew she had him. Their first conversation was brief, a mere exchange of pleasantries. Mira introduced herself as a rising entrepreneur in the fashion world, omitting the fact that her struggling boutique in Brooklyn was barely keeping its doors open. Elliot, ever the businessman, handed her his card, the gleaming Harrington Industries emblem catching the light beneath the chandeliers. He suggested she contact his office if she was looking for connections in the industry. That was all the encouragement she needed. Over the next few weeks, Mira perfected the art of the accidental encounter. She orchestrated run-ins at high-end lounges and elite art galleries, each time acting as if fate had aligned their paths. She was careful, never too eager, never too obvious. Instead, she let Elliot believe he was the one drawn to her. She never asked for anything outright. She knew men like him had been pursued by gold diggers their entire lives. Instead, she fed his ego, made him feel understood in ways others never had. She was witty, fascinating, and when she listened, she made him feel like he was the only man in the world. Elliot found himself craving these encounters. With his pregnant wife occupied by charitable projects and doctor's appointments, Mira became his escape. The intrigue he had felt that night at the gala burned into something more, a reckless temptation against the backdrop of the Manhattan skyline. Desire turned into secret rendezvous, and Elliot, a man who prided himself on logic and control, was about to step into a storm that would unravel everything he had built. Elliot Harrington had always prided himself on being a strategic thinker, a man who could anticipate every move in the corporate world. But his affair with Mira Caldwell shattered the very principles that defined him. What began as harmless flirtation had escalated into something far more dangerous. Soon, Elliot found himself slipping out of the office at odd hours, canceling important meetings and ignoring Lena's calls, all for the next fleeting thrill with Mira. He told himself it was just an escape, a harmless indulgence, but deep down, he knew better. Mira was a master manipulator. She knew exactly how to keep him wanting more, showering him with admiration, marveling at his sharp business acumen, and laughing at even his dullest jokes. She wore the perfume he had once complimented, made reservations at the restaurants he casually mentioned, and always left him with just enough distance to crave her again. But it wasn't just physical. With Mira, Elliot could forget about everything: his responsibilities, his marriage, and the life he had built with his pregnant wife. She made him feel untouchable, free from consequences, unburdened by morality. Yet not everyone was blind to his unraveling. Matthew Clark, the CFO of Harrington Industries and Elliot's closest confidant, had started noticing the cracks. Late-night finance meetings were postponed, expansion projects delayed. Something was off. After covering for Elliot's absence at yet another investor meeting, Matthew finally confronted him. One evening, after the last of the board members had left, he stepped into Elliot's executive suite, loosening his tie. "I covered for you this time, but the board is starting to talk," he said, his tone edged with concern. "And Lena's been calling me, worried out of her mind. What's going on?" Elliot stiffened, guilt flashing across his face before he could suppress it. "I'm under a lot of pressure, Matt. You know how it is," he replied, trying to sound casual. But Matthew wasn't convinced. "You can't just ignore your responsibilities," he pressed. "And Lena, she's pregnant, man. Don't you think she deserves to know what's pulling you away from her?" Elliot looked away, silently cursing himself for being so obvious. But instead of confessing, he did what he always did, doubled down. "I'm handling it," he said coolly, voice tight with irritation. "Let it go." Matthew hesitated, but finally sighed and stepped back. "Just don't let it get out of control." But it already had. That night, alone in the vast emptiness of his penthouse, Elliot caught a glimpse of himself in the floor-length mirror. He barely recognized the man staring back, a wealthy businessman who had everything yet risked losing it all. and for the first time, the weight of his betrayal felt suffocating. Elliot Harrington was walking a dangerous line, compromising everything he once stood for. He was betraying the one person who had never asked for anything but honesty. Meanwhile, Mira Caldwell played her role flawlessly. She never pushed too hard, never overwhelmed him with demands. Instead, she basked in the luxuries he provided. Jewelry, a sleek apartment in Soho, and soon, a brand new sports car. But gifts weren't enough for her. She wasn't interested in just being a fleeting indulgence. She wanted the wealthy husband himself. What neither of them realized was that their web of deception would soon spiral into something far beyond their control. Something that no amount of money or influence could fix. At just 2 months pregnant, Lena Harrington felt the first stirrings of doubt. It started small, a perfume lingering on Elliot's collar that wasn't hers, the distant way he responded when she mentioned their baby, the sudden edge in his voice when she asked why he was coming home so late. She had always imagined pregnancy as a time of joy, a moment that would bring them closer, solidifying their future as a family. In the early weeks, she had felt radiant and full of hope, picturing a life where laughter echoed through their penthouse and love held more value than wealth. But now, something felt wrong. Lena had seen heartbreak before. In her years working with refugees and displaced families, she had witnessed the devastation of betrayal, the way trust could be shattered beyond repair. She just never thought she would be the one living it. Unable to ignore the growing tension in her own home, she confided in her closest friend and personal attorney, Dr. Rachel Patel. Rachel, sharp and intuitive, had always been able to read between the lines. "Trust your instincts," Rachel advised, squeezing Lena's hand over lunch at the foundation. "But don't jump to conclusions without proof. You owe yourself and your child that much." Determined to get answers, Lena decided to confront Elliot. That night, when he stumbled into their penthouse past midnight, she could smell the expensive liquor on his breath, the faint trace of another woman's perfume clinging to his suit. Her hands clenched into fists as she forced herself to stay calm. "Elliot," she said, her voice unsteady, "we need to talk. This can't keep happening." He turned to face her, a flicker of guilt flashing across his expression before his defenses snapped into place. "What do you mean?" His voice was clipped, guarded. "I've been working. Meetings run late." "Not this late," she said, her tone sharper than she intended. For a moment, the air between them was thick with unspoken words, and Lena knew, deep in her heart, that she was standing at the edge of a truth she wasn't ready to face. Lena's voice trembled as she spoke, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Not with that smell on your shirt," she whispered. The air between them thickened with tension, pressing down like a weight neither could ignore. Elliot felt his pulse quicken, a wave of panic surging through him. He had always been quick with words, able to maneuver out of the trickiest business deals with ease. But this was different. "You're imagining things," he muttered, his voice hollow. "I don't know what you're talking about." Lena's lips parted, her breath shaky. "Elliot, please," she pleaded, her voice barely above a whisper. "We used to share everything. Now I feel like you're a stranger. What's happening to us?" For a fleeting moment, guilt clawed at his chest, an unbearable pressure threatening to crack through his defenses. A part of him wanted to drop to his knees, to tell her everything, to beg for forgiveness. But fear and pride held him back. "I've just been under a lot of stress," he mumbled, avoiding her gaze. "I'm sorry if I've been distant." Lena wanted to believe him, wanted to pretend that things weren't unraveling right before her eyes. But deep down, a small voice whispered that the truth was much darker than she dared admit. She remembered Rachel's words. Gather proof. Perhaps she would. But tonight, she was too drained, too heartbroken to fight. Instead, she let him see the pain in her eyes, silently pleading for the man she had married to come back to her. Elliot couldn't face her sorrow. Without another word, he turned and slipped into the bedroom. As he lay in the vast emptiness of their king-sized bed, the space between them felt like an unbridgeable chasm. He stared at the ceiling, wondering how he had let things spiral so far out of control. What he didn't realize was that their world was on the verge of collapsing completely. While Lena wrestled with doubt and quiet devastation, Mira Caldwell was making her next move. The lavish gifts had been thrilling, but they weren't enough. She wasn't just another affair, at least not in her mind. She wanted power. She wanted permanence. She wanted the wealthy businessman himself. She knew Elliot was drawn to her unpredictability, the way she made him feel alive. But desire alone wouldn't secure her place in his life. She needed to make herself indispensable, not just in bed, but in his world. So one afternoon she decided to take control. Without an appointment, she strolled into Harrington Industries, her navy blue pantsuit crisp, her hair styled to perfection. Every step echoed with confidence, her heels clicking against the marble floor like a declaration. Matthew Clark, standing in the lobby, caught sight of her. His sharp eyes narrowed. He knew exactly who she was. Matthew Clark approached with a careful, measured politeness, his sharp eyes locked on the woman standing in the sleek lobby of Harrington Industries. "Miss, may I help you?" Mira Caldwell turned, her lips curving into a poised, knowing smile. "Oh, I'm just here to see Elliot. It's urgent, about our upcoming fashion collaboration." Matthew's suspicions spiked instantly. He knew of no such deal. Keeping his expression neutral, he gave a stiff nod and reached for his phone, dialing Elliot's private line. After a few rings, a clipped response confirmed that she was expected. Mira cast him a victorious glance, as if to say, "I'm closer to him than you think." Inside Elliot's office, the floor-to-ceiling windows framed a breathtaking view of Manhattan, the skyline shimmering beneath the midday sun. Mira strode forward with confidence, setting a sleek folder on his glass desk. "I've been working on a proposal," she said smoothly, her voice laced with quiet authority. Elliot leaned back in his leather chair, studying her with an unreadable expression. "And what makes you think Harrington Industries would invest in small-scale fashion lines?" She arched an eyebrow, unfazed by his skepticism. "Because these aren't just any fashion lines," she countered, flipping open the folder to reveal a collection of mood boards, strategic projections, and detailed marketing plans. Streetwear meets high-end aesthetics, luxury, but accessible. It's a booming market, especially with social media influencers driving trends. If Harrington Industries invests early, you'll corner it before anyone else. Elliot thumbed through the pages, his curiosity piqued despite himself. Her proposal wasn't just well-researched, it was strategic. Mira wasn't just a fleeting indulgence. She was playing a long game, positioning herself as someone he might need, not just want. He knew she was dangerous. A woman like her didn't settle for being a secret. She was ambitious, relentless, but part of him respected that. After all, hadn't he climbed the corporate world the same way? Their conversations shifted to branding, funding, and expansion. Mira was sharp, persuasive, painting a vision of a luxury brand that could redefine the market. And before he realized it, Elliot found himself considering a small-scale investment. As their meeting wrapped up, Mira circled the desk, her presence intoxicatingly close. She reached out, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Thank you for believing in me," she murmured, leaning in. Elliot inhaled the scent of her perfume, smoke and roses, exotic and dangerous. For a fleeting second, the boundaries between business and desire blurred, and he knew he was stepping further into a web he might never escape. Because he wasn't just a businessman anymore. He was a billionaire husband gambling with everything. Mira Caldwell stepped out of Elliot Harrington's office with a confident stride, knowing she had just taken another step toward securing her place in his life. This wasn't just about seduction anymore. She was building something permanent. Her future, built on the ruins of his. As Mira played her game with precision, Lena Harrington's world was unraveling. She tried to focus on her pregnancy, attending her scheduled prenatal checkups with Dr. Rachel Green, a highly regarded obstetrician recommended by Elliot's family. But each time she felt the baby's soft movements inside her, she was reminded of the growing distance between her and her husband. The dream of a perfect family, one filled with love, stability, and warmth, began slipping away. Elliot's absences became more frequent, his excuses more rehearsed. The nagging voice in the back of her mind refused to quiet, whispering suspicions she didn't want to acknowledge. Desperate for clarity, Lena made a decision that went against every instinct. She hired a private investigator. She confided only in Rachel Patel, her trusted friend and attorney, who hesitated but ultimately supported her. "You need to know the truth," Rachel said gently, But don't let your emotions run ahead of the facts. You deserve certainty. Lena still felt conflicted, as though she was betraying Elliot by doubting him. But she couldn't live in uncertainty anymore. David Hawkins, a seasoned investigator with a background in law enforcement, handled the case with quiet efficiency. He didn't pry into her emotions, he only needed details. Elliot's usual schedule, the car he drove, addresses of potential connections. With trembling hands, Lena provided everything, apologizing as she handed him the information. "You're not doing anything wrong," David reassured her. "You just want the truth." The next 10 days were agony. Every time Elliot mentioned a late meeting or urgent business trip, Lena's stomach twisted. Her body was exhausted from pregnancy, her mind overwhelmed with fear. Sleepless nights became the norm, her anxiety mounting with every unanswered call and cold response. There were still moments, fleeting but real, where Elliot would smile at her the way he once had, his hand resting gently on her belly. In those seconds, she allowed herself to hope. But just as quickly, the warmth would disappear, replaced by distance she couldn't explain. It was as though she was living with two versions of her husband, one she loved and one who was slipping further away. On the 11th day, David called. "I have something." They met at a quiet cafe in Midtown. Lena arrived early, wrapping her coat around her shoulders, the fabric feeling heavier than ever. David sat across from her, his expression grim. He slid an envelope across the table. "I think you'll want to see this." Her hands trembled as she reached for it, bracing herself for the truth she had both dreaded and needed to find. Because deep down, she already knew. Her pregnant wife's intuition had been right all along. Lena's hands trembled as she opened the envelope. Photographs spilled out, each capturing Elliot in compromising moments with another woman, Mira Caldwell. There they were, the two holding hands outside an upscale restaurant on Manhattan's Upper East Side, entering a sleek apartment building in Soho late at night and embracing passionately beside a private limousine. The proof was undeniable. Lena felt as if the world tilted around her, tears threatening to spill over as she swallowed hard to keep her composure in public. David Hawkins, the private investigator she had hired, offered a sympathetic nod. "I'm sorry, Lena, there's more. Financial records, real estate transactions, even details of lavish gifts. It's all in the report. Use it however you see fit." Lena's heart ached with a fierce mixture of anger and sorrow. She wanted to scream, to shatter the photos in her trembling hands, to weep uncontrollably for the loss of trust and love. Instead, she forced herself to remain composed until she left the cafe. With her heart pounding and mind swirling with desperate questions. How could Elliot do this while she was his pregnant wife? What had she done wrong? Was there any hope left to salvage their marriage? She clutched the envelope tightly, pressing her hand against her belly as if to protect the life growing within her. She vowed silently that she would not be ignored. Elliot would have to face the consequences of his betrayal or risk losing her forever. Later that night, back at their penthouse, Lena waited alone in the living room. The envelope of photographs was tucked neatly under a small lamp on a side table. Time crawled by as she listened for the familiar ding of the elevator. At long last, shortly after midnight, Elliot stepped into the penthouse. Though visibly tired, he sensed the tension that filled the room. Lena's posture was rigid and resolute, a stark contrast to the gentle, loving partner he once knew. Elliot began hesitantly, removing his coat. "You're still up? Is everything all right?" he asked, his tone tentative. Lena rose slowly, exhaling a shaky breath. "We need to talk," she said, her voice wavering between heartbreak and anger. She motioned toward the sofa, and Elliot reluctantly sat down. The atmosphere was suffocating as Lena retrieved the envelope and with trembling hands laid the photographs on the coffee table. Slowly, she flipped through the images. Elliot's eyes widened in horror as he saw the evidence laid bare before him. "I know, Lena," he managed to say softly, his voice barely audible as tears brimmed in her eyes. "I know about Mira. I know about your affair." For a long, frozen moment, time seemed to stand still in the dim light of the living room. In that agonizing silence, Lena realized that despite Elliot's attempts at denial, the truth was undeniable. The carefully constructed facade of their luxury lifestyle was crumbling, and now every secret, every betrayal, was exposed. Lena felt a deep, irreversible loss, a loss that threatened to change her life and the life of the child she carried forever. Elliot felt the weight of his betrayal settle over him like a crushing force. This was the moment he had feared, the one he had convinced himself he could avoid. Yet here it was, the truth, raw and undeniable, staring him in the face. The air between them was thick with tension. He opened his mouth to speak, but Lena cut him off, her voice trembling yet firm. "You lied to me," she said, her breath unsteady. "You've been disappearing at all hours, making excuses, and you knew I was pregnant. How could you do this to us, to our child?" Elliot's throat went dry. He wanted to explain, to claim it had meant nothing, to beg for forgiveness. But he couldn't find the words. Guilt clung to him like a second skin, impossible to shake. "You told me to trust you," Lena continued, her voice cracking as fresh tears streamed down her face. "You swore you'd love me, stand by me. Was that all a lie? Did our marriage ever mean anything to you?" He finally managed to whisper, "Lena, I do care about you. I swear. I lost myself." "Lost yourself?" she repeated, her expression twisting in disbelief. "You think this is just about you? I'm carrying your child, and you're out there living a double life with her?" For the first time, the full weight of his choices crashed down on him. He saw the woman he had once cherished, her tear-streaked face, the pain in her eyes, the sheer devastation written in every inch of her body. But then, in the back of his mind, there was Mira, the temptation, the excitement, the escape. He had no way out. "I'm sorry," he whispered, but the words felt empty. Lena pressed a protective hand over her belly, her silent vow clear. She would protect her child from any further pain, no matter what it took. "You already hurt me," she said quietly. "Now it's up to you, Elliot. You have to choose. Who do you want to be? Who do you want in your life?" A suffocating silence filled the room. Elliot could only stare at the shattered woman before him, then down at the photographs that exposed every unforgivable betrayal. In the days that followed, he locked himself away in his office, drowning in guilt. He avoided Lena. He avoided Mira. He avoided the reflection in his own mirror. Yet, even as shame consumed him, the allure of the affair still lingered like a ghost. Mira had given him something Lena never could, an escape from the pressure of being a wealthy husband, a man expected to be perfect. His father's words echoed in his mind. A real man faces his responsibilities. But had he ever truly been one? Lena spent her days in silence, seeking solace in the steady rhythm of the ultrasound machine at her prenatal appointments. Each reassuring heartbeat reminded her that despite the chaos surrounding her marriage, her baby was still healthy. Every now and then she allowed herself to pray, not for Elliot, but for the man he used to be. She hoped that somehow he would realize what he was throwing away, that he would see past the illusion Mira had crafted for him and return to his family. But deep down, she feared that hope was slipping through her fingers. Mira, on the other hand, sensed the shift immediately. She knew about the confrontation. Elliot had cut off all personal contact, replying to her messages with short, business-like responses about their supposed luxury brand partnership. He was pulling away. That wasn't an option. So one evening, she decided to force his hand. She breezed past Matthew Clark, ignoring his disapproving glare as she strode into Elliot's sleek corner office. With fierce determination, she closed the door behind her and turned to face him. "You can't just shut me out," she insisted, her voice thick with emotion. Tears welled in her eyes, though even Elliot couldn't tell if they were genuine. "I've given you so much of myself, Elliot. Don't tell me it was all for nothing." His expression was cold, unreadable. "I made a mistake," he said flatly. "I have a wife, a child on the way. I need to fix what I've broken." She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I love you, Elliot. I can give you what you really need: passion, excitement, a future filled with possibilities." Her eyes searched his, pleading. "Don't you see? With me, you don't have to pretend. You can be the man you were always meant to be. Ambitious, free." His resolve wavered. Mira was a drug, intoxicating, dangerous, addictive. She made him feel unstoppable, unburdened by morality or duty. Even as a voice in the back of his mind screamed at him to stop, another part of him longed to surrender. That night, he sat alone in his penthouse, cradling a glass of whiskey, wrestling with his demons. He had spent his entire life making decisions based on logic, on strategy, but for the first time he was choosing recklessly, impulsively. And with that single choice, everything would change. The next morning, Elliot told Lena he was leaving. She had clung to the hope that he would come back to her, that their vows and the child she carried would be enough to pull him from the edge. But when the words left his lips, "I can't do this anymore," they felt like stones, each syllable hitting her with crushing finality. At that moment, Lena knew. Her billionaire husband had chosen his mistress over his family. Elliot's voice was quiet, but the betrayal in his words cut deeper than any scream. "I'm sorry, Lena. I'm moving out." She felt the world tilt, her body trembling as she placed a protective hand over her belly. But when she spoke, her voice was heartbreakingly calm. "If that's your decision, then go," she said, her eyes locking onto his. "But one day, you'll regret this, Elliot. You'll realize what you've done, to me and to our baby." And with that, Elliot Harrington, one of the wealthiest businessmen in America, walked away from the woman who had given him unconditional love, carrying his unborn child. The fallout was immediate. As soon as news of his separation from Lena broke, tabloids had a field day. Gossip columns speculated wildly. Page 6 ran endless rumors. Was it an affair? A financial dispute? Corporate sabotage? The Harrington Industries name, once untouchable, was suddenly dragged through the mud, leaving board members uneasy. Yet Elliot moved forward with the life he had chosen. He relocated to a lavish penthouse on the Upper East Side, funding it through a discreet shell company to avoid scrutiny over personal expenditures. Mira moved in shortly after, her presence turning his once orderly world into a whirlwind of indulgence and excess. For a brief time, Elliot reveled in his newfound freedom. No responsibilities, no moral obligations, just pleasure on his own terms. But beneath the glitz and glamour, cracks began to form. Mira wasn't content with just being his mistress. She wanted power. She started attending investor dinners, inserting herself into business conversations, making it clear she intended to be more than just a shadow in Elliot's life. She pushed him to funnel millions into her struggling luxury fashion brand, Lynx Co. She boasted to close friends, including Clara Morales, that she was on the brink of becoming the next queen of couture, backed by one of the most powerful corporate empires in the world. Matthew Clark saw the warning signs immediately. Sitting across from Elliot in the executive suite, he didn't hold back. "Elliot, you're pouring millions into a company with no real track record. I ran a background check. None of Mira's previous ventures ever turned a profit. You're not just burning your own money, you're putting Harrington Industries at risk." Elliot's jaw tensed, irritation flashing in his eyes. "Stay out of my personal affairs, Matt. If I want to invest in Mira's business, that's my decision." Matthew leaned forward, voice steady. "It's not just your money. You're leveraging company funds. Investors are already asking questions. We have responsibilities to the board, to our employees, to our shareholders." Elliot's patience snapped. "I'll handle the board," he said sharply. "This conversation is over." Matthew stared at the man he had once called his closest friend, now a stranger blinded by arrogance and desire. Frustrated and deeply unsettled, he knew one thing for certain: Elliot was heading straight for disaster, and nothing would stop him. Matthew could do nothing but watch as Elliot spiraled further, accelerating toward inevitable disaster. Whispers filled the halls of Harrington Industries. Once known for its disciplined, strategic leadership, the company now seemed to be falling under the influence of a volatile woman with questionable motives. Employees traded nervous glances, their confidence in Elliot wavering, as his once unshakable business instincts became clouded by reckless indulgence. While Elliot lost himself in Mira's world, Lena faced her own silent battle. She withdrew from the public eye, focusing solely on her pregnancy and philanthropic work, determined to maintain her dignity despite the heartbreak. She had no interest in a legal battle, not yet, but she kept a close watch on Elliot's choices, devastated by how easily he was being manipulated. The warning signs were everywhere. Mira burned through money at an alarming rate, hosting extravagant fashion events, hiring overpriced marketing teams, and splurging on luxury vacations with Elliot. Whenever questioned, she dismissed concerns with a knowing smile, insisting it was all part of building the luxury brand she had envisioned. Yet the returns never came. It was a house of cards, stacked impossibly high, teetering on the edge of collapse. The consequences of Elliot's choices were looming, both financially and emotionally. 7 months into her pregnancy, Lena was rushed to the hospital with severe complications. Stress-induced hypertension and early signs of preeclampsia had put both her and the baby in danger. The emotional toll had pushed her body to its limit, and now she was facing the terrifying possibility of an early delivery. Dr. Rachel Green prescribed strict bed rest and constant monitoring. Despite everything, Lena still held on to the last thread of hope that Elliot would care enough to be there for their child. She hesitated before sending a single text. "I'm in the hospital. Please come." But Elliot never saw it. Mira had made it her mission to control every aspect of his life, including his phone. Whenever a message from Lena appeared, she intercepted it before he could read it. She rationalized it as a small act of protection, convinced that if there were a true emergency, the hospital would call directly. She told herself it was for his peace of mind, that keeping Lena out of his thoughts was necessary to preserve their relationship. Days passed. Lena's condition worsened. Dr. Green warned that if her blood pressure didn't stabilize, they might have no choice but to induce labor early, putting the baby at risk. Janet Whitmore, Lena's longtime friend, remained by her side, horrified that Elliot had not yet arrived. Confused and concerned, Dr. Green called his office directly, hoping to reach him. Mira intercepted that call too. With a calm, practiced voice, she informed the doctor that Elliot was away on a critical business trip. But Elliot wasn't on business. He was in Las Vegas, indulging in a world of excess, oblivious to the fact that his pregnant wife was fighting for both her life and their child's. Elliot sat in the heart of an extravagant luxury brand launch event, the kind of spectacle that made headlines. Mira had insisted that Lenxco needed a grand introduction, a night so dazzling that it would overshadow every competitor. Wrapped in a shimmering gold gown, she draped herself on Elliot's arm, basking in the camera flashes and whispered admiration. The champagne flowed, the music pulsed, and the night blurred into a fever dream of indulgence. Elliot had convinced himself that this was the life he wanted, until his phone buzzed with an urgent call. Matthew Clark's voice was tense, urgent. "Elliot, it's Lena. She's in the hospital. Critical condition. She's been trying to reach you for days." The room seemed to tilt around him. Elliot turned to Mira, searching for some kind of reassurance, but her expression was carefully neutral. I didn't know," she stammered, though the flicker in her eyes told a different story. His stomach twisted. Without another word, Elliot broke free from the glitz and indulgence, ignoring the murmurs of onlookers as he rushed out of the venue. Within an hour, he was on his private jet, speeding back to New York. By the time he arrived at the hospital, Lena had already been rushed into emergency surgery. The sterile white walls of the waiting area felt suffocating as he paced outside the operating room, terror gripping his chest like a vice. How had he let it come to this? Every moment he had wasted, every ignored call, every deleted message, flashed before his eyes. He had spent months drowning in temptation, lying to himself about what truly mattered. And now, it might have cost him everything. Minutes stretched into agonizing hours. When Dr. Rachel Green finally emerged from the operating room, her face was etched with exhaustion. Elliot's entire body tensed, bracing for words that could shatter him. She took a breath, her voice quiet but heavy with sorrow. "We managed to save the baby," she said softly. "A little boy." A moment of relief surged through him, but then he saw the grief in her eyes. "But Lena," the doctor swallowed hard, forcing herself to continue. "She suffered severe complications. Her heart gave out under the strain. We tried everything, but she's gone." It felt like the air had been ripped from his lungs. The world around him blurred. The sound of footsteps, the hum of medical machines, the murmurs of hospital staff, all of it faded into an unbearable silence. Gone. Lena, the woman who had been his anchor, the one person who had loved him without condition, was gone. And he had not been there. Elliot staggered backward, his mind refusing to accept the words. Overwhelmed by shock, guilt, and an unbearable grief, he collapsed into a chair, burying his face in his hands. For the first time in his life, his wealth, his power, none of it mattered. He had lost the only thing that ever truly did. His pregnant wife was gone, and it was all his fault. Elliot sat frozen, his body racked with silent sobs, something he hadn't allowed himself to do since his father's funeral. Nurses and orderlies passed by, offering him space to grieve. In the neonatal unit, his son clung to life in an incubator, his tiny body fighting for each fragile breath. Dr. Rachel Green led Elliot to the glass, where he gazed upon the child who was both a miracle and a reminder of all he had lost. The baby's eyes remained shut, unaware of the tragedy that had unfolded, unaware that he no longer had a mother. Elliot felt his knees weaken. A wave of emotions crashed over him, overwhelming guilt, an aching paternal instinct, and a deep, gnawing remorse. He had forsaken what mattered most, and now it was too late. Lena's final words echoed in his mind. "One day, you'll regret this. You'll realize what you've done." That day had arrived in the cruelest way imaginable. Matthew Clark approached him, his voice sharp with barely contained contempt. "She doesn't want to see you. Go home." Mira left the hospital in tears, sensing that the hold she once had on Elliot had crumbled. For the first time, he didn't chase after her. He didn't care. A few days later, Lena's funeral was held in a modest ceremony, attended by family, close friends, and countless individuals whose lives she had touched through her humanitarian work. The quiet sobs of mourners filled the small church, the stained glass windows casting muted colors over grief-stricken faces. Elliot stood at the front, his once imposing presence now hollow and broken. His voice cracked as he spoke, his hands trembling. "Lena was the best of us. She cared more about others than herself. She taught me the meaning of love, of true compassion. And I threw it all away." The weight of his loss crushed him mid-sentence, his composure shattered, his tears turning into agonizing sobs. The congregation, too stunned to do anything else, could only weep with him. In the days that followed, Elliot took a leave of absence from Harrington Industries. He moved back into the penthouse, but the once opulent space felt lifeless, haunted by memories of Lena. The laughter that once filled their home had been replaced by unbearable silence. Each day he spent hours in the nursery, watching his newborn son through the glass of the NICU. The baby, hooked up to monitors and tubes, fought to survive, just as Lena had. Elliot vowed that he would protect him, no matter what. But reality was unrelenting. No amount of money, no influence, no power could undo the past. Mira's calls and messages went unanswered. The allure of indulgence and excess had lost all meaning. Elliot had finally discovered, far too late, that the true cost of his betrayal was beyond anything he could have imagined. He named his son James, in honor of Lena's father. The baby spent weeks in the NICU, battling the complications of premature birth, while doctors worked tirelessly to stabilize his condition. His billionaire husband's fortune could buy anything, except a second chance. Elliot sat beside the incubator, watching his fragile son cling to life. Every soft beep of the monitors was a reminder of how delicate existence truly was. He had once felt invincible, untouchable. Now, stripped of illusion, all he could do was sit vigil, drowning in the weight of his choices. Matthew Clark observed the unraveling of the man he had once admired. He felt sympathy. Elliot had lost the woman who had been the guiding light of his life. But at the same time, Matthew couldn't ignore the truth. Elliot had made his own choices, lured into destruction by Mira Caldwell's ambition. This wasn't just a tragedy. It was the inevitable consequence of betrayal. Janet Whitmore, Lena's dearest friend and a longtime confidant of the Harrington family, stepped in to care for baby James. She shuttled between the hospital and the penthouse, sometimes bringing warm meals, other times sitting by the incubator reading softly to the infant. She became a steady, nurturing presence, the kind of comfort Lena would have wanted for her child. When James was finally discharged, his tiny body still reliant on oxygen support, Janet ensured that the nursery was stocked with everything he needed. Yet, no amount of preparation could fill the void left by Lena's absence. Meanwhile, the board of Harrington Industries was demanding answers. The company's stock had taken a hit in the wake of scandalous headlines, whispers of Elliot's affair, and the tragic circumstances of Lena's death. Investors were growing uneasy about the direction of a corporation led by a CEO drowning in personal turmoil. Matthew took control where Elliot faltered. He reassured major stakeholders, promising renewed focus, ethical leadership, and stability. In a move that was both difficult and necessary, he convened an emergency board meeting, presenting a comprehensive plan to mitigate financial damage. And then, the truth about Mira was exposed. Forensic accountants uncovered that Harrington Industries' investment in Lynx Co. had been a financial disaster. The brand had hemorrhaged funds at an alarming rate, and investigators discovered that Mira had funneled large sums into offshore accounts, manipulated invoices, fraudulent expense reports. It was all a carefully orchestrated scheme. The board was livid. They demanded immediate action. Humiliated and enraged, Elliot had no choice but to authorize an internal investigation. All funding to Lynx Co. was cut off, brand partnerships were frozen, and the legal team prepared to press charges if Mira didn't return the stolen money. To those who had seen her merely as Elliot's companion, the revelation was shocking. But to Matthew, and to anyone who had truly paid attention, it was clear. Mira had always been an opportunist, leaving destruction in her wake. Sensing the walls closing in, she made one last desperate move. She reached out to the tabloids, spinning half-truths and exaggerated fabrications about her relationship with Elliot, hoping that if she couldn't win, she could at least take him down with her. For the billionaire husband, the cost of his betrayal was still unfolding, and the worst was yet to come. Mira spun herself as the victim of a wealthy businessman's deception, telling tabloids that Elliot had promised her the world only to discard her the moment she became inconvenient. She painted herself as the heartbroken woman, scorned by a man too powerful to face consequences. At first, some were willing to believe her. But her story quickly unraveled. A major publication conducted an in-depth investigation, exposing the truth behind Mira's fraudulent financial dealings. The sympathy she had once sought slipped through her fingers, and public opinion turned against her. She was no longer seen as a victim, but as the gold digger who had knowingly torn apart a marriage. Elliot felt no pity for her. If anything, he blamed himself for ever allowing her into his life. When he uncovered the full extent of her deception, the fabricated credentials, the falsified business records, the hidden offshore accounts, he was enraged. But beneath the fury was something far worse: remorse. In a final, desperate phone call, Mira begged him for leniency. "Elliot, please. I did it for us, for our future. Don't let them destroy me. We can fix this." He listened in silence, then spoke, his voice hollow. "I destroyed my own future the day I chose you over Lena, and I won't let you twist the truth to save yourself." He hung up, feeling nothing but emptiness. That night, as he stood in his opulent penthouse, surrounded by the cold luxury of modern art, marble floors and glittering skyline views, he wondered how he had let his wealth blind him to what truly mattered. If only he had recognized the hollowness inside himself sooner. If only he had seen what he was losing before it was too late. Maybe Lena would still be alive. Days turned into weeks, then months. Elliot handed over more of his corporate responsibilities to Matthew, limiting his role at Harrington Industries to overseeing only major strategic decisions. Instead, he focused on the only thing that mattered: raising James. Despite early health concerns, James grew stronger with each passing day. By the time he reached 6 months, the fragile newborn had become a bright-eyed child, his tiny gurgles filling the once silent penthouse. Elliot noticed something in his son's gentle gaze, a spark of kindness, a softness that reminded him of Lena. He began keeping a journal, writing letters addressed to James for the day he would be old enough to understand. In those pages, Elliot recounted how he met Lena, the way she had changed his life, and the devastating mistake that had cost him everything. He wrote about responsibility, about the moral duty a man has to his family. He confessed his failures, not just as a husband, but as a human being. The process was painful. It broke him open. But in some small way, it was also his first step toward redemption. Matthew and Janet saw the change in him. The arrogance that once defined him was gone. At Harrington Industries, he humbled himself before the board, offering an apology for the chaos he had caused. For the first time in his life, Elliot Harrington wasn't the man who had all the answers, just one trying to rebuild from the wreckage of his past. Elliot established a charitable foundation in Lena's name, dedicating it to the causes she had been most passionate about: women's health, refugee assistance, and legal aid for underserved communities. The board of Harrington Industries, initially skeptical, watched as he poured himself into the initiative, proving that this wasn't just a PR stunt. Slowly, their confidence in his leadership began to rebuild. Stock prices, once shaky after the scandal, started to recover as public sentiment shifted. Yet no financial rebound or philanthropic effort could erase the emptiness Lena had left behind. Her absence lingered in every corner of his life. In quiet moments, Elliot would hear her laugh in his memories, picture the way she used to ruffle his hair when he was stressed, recall the softness in her eyes when she spoke about the future they were supposed to build together. A framed photo of her remained on his desk, a picture from their honeymoon in Fiji. She stood barefoot in the sand, wearing a simple white sundress, her eyes sparkling with pure joy. Some nights, he found himself talking to that photo, whispering apologies to a love that could no longer hear him. Meanwhile, the legal battle with Mira dragged on for months. Harrington Industries' legal team cornered her, forcing her to return much of the stolen funds. To avoid a high-profile trial, she negotiated a plea deal and disappeared from the social scene, rumored to be hiding in Europe under a new identity. Elliot refused to follow the rumors. To him, that chapter was closed. The year after Lena's passing, Elliot stood at her graveside in Fairhaven, Massachusetts, cradling James in his arms. The boy, now a wide-eyed 1-year-old, clung to his father's coat as the cool autumn breeze rustled the leaves around them. Elliot knelt down, placing a bouquet of sunflowers, her favorite, against the modest headstone bearing her name. His throat tightened. "Lena," he murmured, voice thick with emotion. "I'm so sorry. Thank you for giving me our beautiful son. I promise I'll do better. I'll become a man you'd be proud of, and I'll raise him to know who his mother was. Your kindness, your strength, it lives in him." James cooed softly, as if sensing the weight of the moment. In the stillness, Elliot felt both the crushing weight of guilt and the flicker of hope. Life would never be the same without Lena. But maybe, just maybe, this was his chance to atone, to reshape the wealthy businessman he had once been into someone who truly honored her legacy. Returning to New York, Elliot embraced a new role, not just as a CEO, but as a father first. The man he had once been, the one who chased wealth, power, and indulgence, had died the day Lena took her last breath. Now, all that mattered was raising his son, ensuring that James grew up knowing the story of the mother who had loved him before he ever took his first breath. Elliot spent his mornings feeding James, cherishing the giggles and the messes. He took extended paternal leave, stepping away from Harrington Industries and entrusting daily operations to Matthew. He joined parenting groups, studied baby care manuals, and even attempted homemade purees, most of which ended up on the floor rather than in his son's mouth. Neighbors and staff at the penthouse watched in quiet amazement as the once impeccable CEO, always dressed in tailored suits, now wrestled with baby food stains and diaper emergencies. He was unashamed to admit he was learning, fumbling through fatherhood one day at a time. In the corporate world, whispers spread. Elliot Harrington had changed. Board members who had once doubted his character now saw a man transformed. He shifted Harrington Industries' focus towards sustainable investments, championed ethical business practices, and doubled the company's philanthropic budget. In private, Matthew admitted that this was the best version of Elliot he had ever seen, a man humbled, driven not by power or greed, but by love for his son. Still, the past never left him. At night, the nightmares came. He would relive the moment he chose Mira over Lena, the frantic hospital corridors, Dr. Green's sorrowful expression, the finality of watching Lena's casket disappear into the ground. He would wake drenched in sweat, gasping for breath, guilt crashing over him like a tidal wave. But every morning, James' innocent smile reminded him that he still had a reason to keep going, that he had a duty to at least try to be the kind of father Lena would have wanted for their son. Years passed. One spring afternoon, when James was old enough to babble his first words, Elliot carried him in his arms to the newly opened Lena Harrington Maternity Center, a facility dedicated to providing health care for underprivileged women. Standing before the building's dedication plaque, Elliot gently lifted James onto his hip. His fingers traced over the engraved words, "Dedicated to the memory of Lena Sullivan Harrington, whose compassion changed countless lives. May her spirit guide us to protect and nurture those who need it most." Tears welled in his eyes as he pressed a soft kiss against James's forehead. "Your mom would have loved this place," he whispered. In that moment, he felt something he hadn't in years. Her presence, her warmth, as if she were watching over them, offering silent approval. Over time, high society softened its judgment. They saw that Elliot carried the weight of his remorse, that every action he took now was meant to heal, not only himself, but the world Lena had fought for. Invitations to galas resumed. Philanthropic partnerships flourished. He reclaimed his place in boardrooms and red carpets. But no matter how many billions he controlled, a part of him remained humbled, never forgetting that his billionaire husband's wealth had once driven him to ruin. Lena's legacy lived on, not just in the charitable programs founded in her name or the medical missions she had once championed, but in James. He had her kind eyes, her gentle nature, and an innocence untainted by the pain that had shaped his father's regrets. Elliot Harrington continued to build financial success, but no amount of power or prestige could erase the deep regret that had become a permanent part of him. Wealth had once blinded him, leading him down a path of betrayal, but it could never buy back what he had lost. The tragedy of Lena's death and the near loss of their child became the defining moment that changed Elliot forever. His betrayal had left a scar, one that would never fully heal. Love, once broken by selfishness, could never be mended entirely. But in fatherhood, in dedicating himself to the causes Lena had fought for, he found a small measure of redemption. Though the world remembered him as a wealthy husband who had fallen into scandal, Elliot discovered his true purpose in the eyes of a little boy who expected nothing more from him than love. And for Elliot, that love was the only measure of his worth, the only way he could ever truly honor the memory of the woman he had forsaken. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey of love, betrayal, and redemption. Billionaire chose his mistress over his pregnant wife. The tragic consequence he will never forget is a powerful reminder that in the ruthless pursuit of desire, we often risk losing what is most precious. Elliot's story is proof that no empire is worth building if it stands on the shattered remains of a heart once filled with devotion. If this story moved you, please consider liking the video and sharing your thoughts in the comments. Help us reach more people by sharing this with friends. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more gripping, heartfelt tales. Your support makes our storytelling possible, and we can't wait to bring you more narratives that resonate with life's deepest lessons. Thank you, and we'll see you in the next story.